Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us at noon on Friday for a Jewish community conversation. It's an exciting one today. My name is Joel Rubin. I'm the Executive Director of the American Jewish Congress, and we are thrilled and fortunate to have Congressman Jamie Raskin here to speak with us about his views on issues of deep concern to the country and to the American Jewish community. But before we get started, I wanted to introduce our president, Jack Rosen. And Jack, maybe if you wanted to share some thoughts, and then I'll get it rolling after that.
Well, we've got a limited amount of time, but Congressman Raskin, thank you so much for taking the time to get on with us. This is an awfully important time for our community, for our country, and you seem to work on all these issues, whether it's the January 6th investigation or it's anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. So we look forward to, hearing you on these subject matters. And I want to thank all of the participants for taking the time to get on, and I'm sure we'll enjoy it. So Joel, let me turn it back to you now.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate it. So everyone, I'll just open up briefly with a quick intro of Jamie, Congressman Raskin, who's a personal friend and my congressman in Maryland's 8th Congressional District, and a real fighter for our district and for people across the United States. Someone who I know not only do I personally admire, but multiple generations of people in our community look up to him for his leadership, especially right now. So that's why we're so fortunate to have you here, Jamie, with us to share your thoughts. Just a couple of things about the congressman. He was a tenured law professor for 25 years, a nationally renowned expert in constitutional law, a state senator in the Maryland General Assembly, a leading voice fighting for progressive goals on gun control, on human rights, on LGBTQ rights, really leading the way. He is now in his 3rd term in Congress. He, in this term, only 3 terms now, has made a massive impact on the national debate related to democracy, civil rights. As many folks watching now may know as well, he was the lead manager of the 2nd impeachment of then President Trump. He's now, as Jack said, serving on the January 6th Commission, looking at issues that are near and dear to our hearts, which is why we invited him here today, because he is focusing quite a bit on extremism, on white supremacy, domestic terrorism, and issues that are really impacting the Jewish community. And I should say, of course, I will mention Jamie being a Jewish and American Jew. I'd love to call you a mensch here as well, and someone who really does understand deep in his bones and in his kishkas what the American Jewish community is thinking and feeling across all the different streams of our thoughts. So Jamie, I thank you again. Just for folks, before I hand it off to you, Congressman, I'm sorry, I'll flip back and forth between 2 titles. We are going to take questions, but please do text them in, and I'll try my best to share the questions with the Congressman as we go on. And we'll have a bit of a back and forth Q&A prior to that. And again, our goal is to end by 12:30. Jamie, if you'd like to share a few opening thoughts, and then we'll get rolling.
Joel, dear man, thank you. Jack, thank you for your lovely and warm introduction. Joel, it's my first time getting to salute you and interact with you in your new capacity as Executive Director of the American Jewish Congress. That's awesome. That's just a terrific thing for you personally, but for all of us in the Jewish community and for the country. And Jack, thank you for your magnificent service to everybody. Well, how long do I get to talk for? Like about 8 minutes or 10 minutes? Is that tell me, just give me my instructions and wind me up and I'll go. And
I mean, 3 to 5, 6
3 to 5
start.
All right,
but then I got some good questions for you.
Good. All right, let me get right into it then, my friends. As Jack was saying, we have a lot of work on a lot of different fronts in terms of anti-Semitism and racism, as well as the defense of democracy. And for me, these things are profoundly interwoven. Anti-Semitism and racism are the gateway to destruction of liberal democracy in the country. And we understand that. So the Jewish community, the African-American community, other minorities have not just a self-interested stake in defending ourselves against resurgent domestic violent extremism and white supremacy. But we also have a stake as citizens, along with all other citizens, in defending democratic institutions. And we've seen the way in which conspiracy theory and lies, disinformation, propaganda, totalitarian ways of thinking have become a threat both to our individual communities and to the survival of democracy itself. And all of that exploded on January 6th. Let me just say a word about January 6th, and then we can just open it up. You know, there were 3 rings of activity that took place on that day that nearly toppled the 2020 presidential election and American democracy. One ring was a mass demonstration called by the former president, Donald Trump, for a wild protest in DC that turned into a riot. And there you had a mixture of people, some of whom arrived with malevolent intent, and many of whom arrived with perfectly innocent, good faith intentions of protesting under their misimpression that Donald Trump had actually won the election because of the propounding of this big lie that somehow it was being stolen from him, a lie that had been decisively refuted by 61 different federal and state courts, which rejected every allegation of electoral fraud and corruption in no uncertain terms. And there was nothing on the other side. And nonetheless, it proceeded at that outer ring and turned into a riot. Where more than 140 police officers were wounded, hit over the head with Confederate battle flags, with American flags, lead pipes, hockey sticks, and so on. We had people with broken jaws, broken noses, broken necks, broken vertebrae, broken arms, legs, people with traumatic brain injuries, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and so on. Okay, in the second ring, in the middle ring, this was the realm of the so-called insurrection, I would call it, where we find the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the Aryan Nations, the Ku Klux Klan, the various militia groups, and the QAnon networks who had been organizing very carefully for this day. And this is a lot of what we are finding in the research of the bipartisan select committee on the January 6th attacks. These people were very well funded. There were millions of dollars put into the effort, and they became the frontline vanguard stormtroopers of the mass demonstration that turned into a riot. And they were the first ones to begin to attack and assault the police officers, break the windows, and storm the building. And then at the very inner core, this is the realm of the coup. Now, the coup is an interesting word for the American political lexicon, of course, because we have no experience with coups up until this point. And it's also odd because we usually think of coups as something as taking place against a president, but this was a coup organized by the president against the vice president, Mike Pence, and against the Congress. And it was the culmination of several months' efforts to overturn what was the genuine popular result. Joe Biden beat Donald Trump by more than 7.5 million votes. He defeated him 306 to 232 in the Electoral College. But the whole point was to advance a theory that was being floated by Professor John Eastman and by Steve Bannon, that the vice president had the unilateral power to reject Electoral College votes and to return the electors from Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, which was the effort there. That would have lowered Joe Biden's majority in the Electoral College below 270, creating a failure of the Electoral College. And then under the 12th Amendment, the whole contest would have been kicked into the House of Representatives for a so-called contingent election. And you ask, why would Donald Trump have tried to get the contest moved into the House where Nancy Pelosi was in charge? Well, under the 12th Amendment, it's very clear that we don't vote one member, one vote. We vote one state, one vote. And after the 2020 elections, the GOP controlled 27 state delegations. We had 22, and Pennsylvania was split right down the middle in a tie. Now, I don't think that Wyoming would have gone for Trump, even in a contingent election, because Liz Cheney would not have cast her vote that way. It still would have left him with a 26 vote majority. They would have declared it over at that point. And in fact, Michael Flynn had plans at that moment for the president to invoke the Insurrection Act and declare martial law to bring in the National Guard finally at the end of the day to put down the chaos and the insurrection that they had unleashed against us. So that's as close to fascism as I ever want to come in my life, or I want my children or my grandchildren to be exposed to. And we have a powerful lucid, bipartisan committee chaired by Benny Thompson from Mississippi, vice chaired by Liz Cheney from Wyoming. And we are determined to get to the absolute truth of how this was organized, how it was coordinated, how it was financed in response to House Resolution 503, which gave us a mandate to deliver this report. And of course, we had originally asked for an independent outside commission with no members of Congress involved, but that was blocked by the GOP when Donald Trump decided he didn't want any investigation at all. So this goes right to the heart of whether we are going to survive as a democracy. And as I was saying at the beginning, all of us, I think, are deeply invested in the success of American democracy and the defense of our institutions. So why don't we use that to open it up? And I'm delighted to take anybody's questions.
Thank you, Jamie. Jack, would you like to pictuate first question, and then we'll do it back and forth, and I'll take them as they come. Thank you, Jamie. You're on mute, Jack. Sorry. One second, Jack. I think you're still on mute.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Thank you. No worries.
Said somebody once taught me, great PR person, that you got to read the front page of the news to find out what interests America and Americans, and what we see every day is a January 6th investigation that you're going through. So there's a sense that you are not going to get full cooperation, that you run out of time, with all of the legal gimmickry that goes on. What is sort of plan 2 here? Let's assume you get to a point where, you don't get Trump's papers, you don't get Bannon, et cetera, et cetera. What is it that you hope the committee achieves at that point?
Well, I appreciate that very much, Jack, because our plan 2 is really plan 1. And I want people to leave with the sense that we're actually finding tremendous success in terms of the witnesses we're asking for. We've had more than 275 people now voluntarily appear before the committee, render truthful testimony, give us extraordinary documents, eye-opening information about how all of this was organized and how the attack was perpetrated against us. I know the media has wanted to focus on a handful of people like Steve Bannon, who insist on becoming Batman villains. I mean, Steve Bannon, of course, has been trying to organize the alt-right, basically the neo-fascist right internationally for a long time now. And, Jeffrey Clark, for his own reasons, because he tried to make a play to become Attorney General, he also has become an extremely reluctant witness, as has John Eastman. But the good news is that they're surrounded by people who are testifying, who are telling us exactly what all of them were up to. So I believe we're going to come back with an overwhelmingly fine-grained portrait of the causes of January 6th, what took place on that day, all the way to the Oval Office, and then what we need to do to stabilize and fortify American democracy for the century. I mean, every authoritarian despot, kleptocrat, bully on earth is rooting for Donald Trump to come back. Putin in Russia, and General Xi in China, and Orban in Hungary, the anti-Semite who spends all of his time running against George Soros, Duterte in the Philippines, you name it. These are the people that are in league against democracy internationally. But we've got friends on the democracy side, both in America and all over the world. So, I wouldn't bet against this committee. I've never been on a better committee because we don't spend our time in cross-partisan polemic and invective all day. We're actually focused on the goal here, and I think we will reach it in the new year.
Jamie, if I could build on that question and maybe try to peel back a layer on here on anti-Semitism. You hinted at it a little bit. A lot of our work and our research and our writing over the recent years has been about the connections between extremism, white supremacy, anti-Semitism. There's been a significant spike over the past decade according to FBI statistics, in targets, in Jews being targeted as primary religious victims of hate. can you share your thoughts on what that means to you, how that impacts your thinking, and what you see in the connections between anti-Semitism and this kind of extreme behavior that you're studying right now up on the Hill?
Well, look, obviously on January 6th itself, I mean, we saw people walking around with T-shirts that said Camp Auschwitz staff on them. There were all manners of racist and anti-Semitic groups that were there, that stormed the Capitol. And, many of them were repeat players, of course, from Charlottesville 2017. I think people understand how Donald Trump used this layer of the insurrection to surround his coup because it was in his interest. But I think fewer people have focused on the fact that all of these groups, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, the Aryan Nations, and so on, they used him too. I mean, back in Charlottesville, they had around 500 people who went and marched. By the time they got to January 6, 2021, there were now thousands within that layer, and they were at the front of a march of 50 or 60,000 people. And if you go to the extreme right websites, they all talk about how they almost knocked over the US government. And next time, they're not leaving their firearms in their cars and back in the hotels and motels. So, you could talk to any Jewish member of Congress, any Black member of Congress. We, our phones, our emails are filled with racist, anti-Semitic filth. We all have death threats. I had to get a restraining order against somebody last week. So, I mean, this is for real. And the anti-Semitism is resurgent, and it's around the world. My grandfather was, my maternal grandfather was the first Jewish person ever elected to the Minnesota state legislature back in the 1930s and 40s. And he was a proud FDR, New Dealer, Democratic Farm Labor, progressive, liberal, Zionist Democrat. And I feel like I've got an obligation to him and his generation to stand up strong for democracy all over the world, for security of the American Republic, for the security of Israel, for the security of democracies everywhere, and for human rights everywhere.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, and to go on that train of thought, and we're getting some good questions coming in as well, and wanted to get your take on how you take this and this investigation, this report, your work, and how do you envision potentially taking real action that can push back against the increase of anti-Semitism, the verbal attacks, the physical attacks, the threats that you personally are facing. What do you see as the ways that Congress can get involved, and by extension, then when speaking to groups like ours and groups in the community in this space, what do you think we should be thinking about and doing to reject this type of increased hate?
Well, I appreciate that. The first thing we have to do is, of course, stand up for the truth and memory, something our community knows a lot about. I mean, before we saw neo-Nazis marching in the streets of Charlottesville or around the country, the same forces were trying to deny the Holocaust and to perpetrate absolute fiction and propaganda about the Holocaust. And we've got to tell the truth. And just like we have to tell the truth about the events of the last century, we got to tell the truth about the events of this century. Donald Trump is out there saying that, his supporters greeted the police officers with hugs and kisses, and it was a nonviolent event. Some people don't want to deal with that. I see some messages coming in. People keep talking about, or someone keeps talking about AOC. AOC never punched a police officer in the face and tried to kill people, but talk to Officer Sicknick's family. I mean, this is a serious, real threat. Some people would like to sweep the whole thing under the rug. I just don't think that's a morally, ethically, politically, or historically responsible position. And a lot of our Republican colleagues are there saying, well, we've heard enough about January 6th. Now let's, go on to talk about, the Second Amendment and so on. So we're not going to allow people to forget it. And we're going to make the legislative recommendations for what we need to do to fortify the electoral process, to vindicate the popular will, to strengthen democracy, to combat domestic violent extremism. The Department of Homeland Security and the FBI have both said that violent white supremacy is the single greatest threat to the security of the American people on the home front in terms of terrorism. And, you don't have to tell Black people in America that when the KKK or other extreme rightists go out and kill people, that is terrorism. That is domestic terror. So we're going to deal with that as well. And we got to deal with the problem of the social media, which on the one hand, in a positive sense, brings us closer together and allows us to get good information out. But at the same time, of course, it allows people to get bad information out. And, Mark Twain was right that the lies travel around the world before the truth can get its shoes on. And the internet has been used to spread both ancient anti-Semitic myths and canards, but also to spread newfangled propaganda as well.
Yeah, let me just pitch one more question on this and sort of maybe try to pull you into an interesting episode that you went through that does I think you had a very interesting response to dealing with it, which was about a month ago or so. Several groups in the Jewish community, groups with whom we partner often, were asked to not participate in a voting rights rally, and because they were pro-Israel, and that was pushed, and then that was something that we rejected, and you rejected too. And I wanted to get your insight as to your thinking about what we're looking at when we're looking at anti-Semitic activity coming from our progressive allies as well. And how do you sort of think that through and respond? And what's an effective way to respond?
I was profoundly troubled by that. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I think it was a rally for voting rights and for our anti-gerrymandering provisions within HR 1. And of course, speaking from a partisan perspective, I mean, gerrymandering is a huge threat not only to democracy, but to the fate of the Democratic Party, because we're being gerrymandered into oblivion in Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Texas. And we're trying to get rid of it and move to independent redistricting panels. But some of my friends across the aisle are wed to gerrymandering. I told them on the floor the other day they're the gerrymander-only party. But in any event, there was a rally about it. And so we're trying to get people standing together for democracy. And then there's a group in DC called, the local DC Sunrise Group, which says we're not going to participate because there are pro-Israel groups there. And there are several things wrong with that. First of all, it defeats the whole idea of what a coalition is and what an alliance is of bringing people together. Secondly, a number of the groups they were talking about weren't even explicitly pro-Israel groups. They were just Jewish groups. And so, that's an old, anti-Semitic trope and canard. But I want Israel, like I want every other country in the world, to be on the side of strong democracy and human rights, and not on the side of Vladimir Putin and Orban and right-wing fascist forces all over the world. And so, for me, what it means to be pro-Israel, just like what it means to be patriotic in America, is to support democracy, the Constitution, the rule of law, and human rights here and there. So I feel, but forgive me, I'm focusing on you, Joel, but I think Mr. Liederman or someone is bombarding me with questions. I'd love the chance to hear from him directly. I think he's imputing anti-Semitism to the Democratic Party, the party which has stood up since at least the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and over the last half century, for the human rights of the people. It also was a Democratic president who, of course, recognized Israel within, I think it was 8 minutes. It was President Harry Truman who did that. So, that just sounds like a partisan Republican attack. I wonder if the good gentleman who's querying me wants to say something about the anti-Semitism that was on display on January 6th, and the fact that Republicans refused to denounce it. And I have several Republican colleagues this last week who are demanding the release of what they're calling political prisoners. These are people who assaulted federal officers, trespassed on the federal government, and tried to disrupt a federal proceeding. I don't know if he agrees with that position. But forgive me, I don't want to be pulled down into the partisan mud, but it seems like everything becomes partisan. It's very difficult just to stand for principles without somebody, trying to turn it into a partisan football. And I should say Liz Cheney's about my best friend in Congress today, and she is a proud Republican.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. The only thing I'll also, well, first of all, thank you for responding that way. I should also mention to folks that one of our co-chairs of our advisory board to counter domestic terrorism, white supremacy, Jack, is a co-chair, the leader and the visionary behind it. Denver Riggleman, former congressman from Virginia, is helping support the January 6th Commission as well. And we take this very seriously in these threats. I know we're coming up on close to 12:30, and this has been fantastic. Jack, I wanted to know if you had any additional question that you wanted to ask the congressman.
No, Joel, there's half hour certainly isn't enough to cover all the subject matter. I think, look, you can't be American Jewish Congress and not bring up Iran. So maybe you can just tell us what the plan, I'm into Plan Bs today. What does Plan B on Iran look like?
Well, yes, thank you for raising that. I know that President Biden sent emissaries over to meet with them to see if there's any hope of reviving the nuclear accord. Obviously, the abrogation and termination of that agreement has been a nightmare because now Iran is back out trying to develop nuclear weapons. I think we have to do everything we can to try to restore diplomacy and what that agreement was, if it's still possible to do that. We know that Iran is a bad actor in the neighborhood, has been supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, and has been spreading anti-Semitism, just like Saudi Arabia has been a leading purveyor and disseminator of anti-Semitism and contributed the 9/11 hijackers and teaching anti-Semitic filth in the madrasa schools all over the region. We got some very bad players there. We should be doing everything we can to promote human rights and democracy, and to strengthen the forces of reason in the region. Obviously, there's no appetite in America for a war, just declaring war on Iran or anybody else. So we have to take the hard path of diplomacy and nonviolent resolution of this conflict. But I think that the abrogation of the Iran nuclear accords was an absolute nightmare, and it's being proven by everything that's happened since.
Last question I got to ask before we go, because I'm sorry, I'm going to hold you for one more minute on this. We'd just love to hear your thoughts right now on the state of American-Israeli relations and what you see. Now there's a new government in Israel, and what do you see taking place? What's Israel needs all the friends it can get. Just what's your sense of things as they are between us and Israel right now, and that's a very open question.
As I've been saying, Joel, I've got high hopes for the survival and flourishing of democracy and human rights around the world, and the democracies support each other. I think getting beyond the Netanyahu period has created some really good opportunities, just like getting beyond the Trump period has created some really good opportunities for us to make some international democratic progress. But it's fragile, and so we have to support democratic forces, parties, movements, and governments all over the world, and we've got to support human rights all over the world. I mean, what else can we do? So we're in a big struggle, and we're in the middle of that struggle, and I know that the American Jewish Congress is going to be standing up for those values moving into the future. And I'm glad to stand with you.
It's wonderful. So I can't say thank you enough for taking a half an hour here, a little bit more than that, to share with us. Thank you for your service and your leadership. your commitment to American democracy. We benefit from it. We're grateful for it. And I hopefully look forward to continuing to have you engage with us in the future in these really important conversations. And to everybody on the call, thank you for joining us for another Jewish community conversation. We promise stimulating discussion, and I hope that this one definitely brought out a lot of ideas. I know it certainly did for me, and a lot of passion for the kind of work that we all care about. So, Jack, if any last words to say thank you.
Oh, well, keep up the good work, please. We need you badly there.
Well, thank you, Jack. Thank you, Joel, for your magnificent leadership for the Jewish community. Thank you, American Jewish Congress, for everything you've stood for historically and everything you're going to stand for going into a still turbulent future. I appreciate it very much. All best to you guys.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.